This past Tuesday, a majority of American voters selected a fascist as our next president. And yesterday, November 9th, marked the anniversary of Kristallnacht, which history remembers as the first act of the Holocaust, triggered by the rise of fascism in Germany in 1938. I know I'm not the only person who sees a connection between those two events, and I'm not the only person who is angry, sad, fearful, disappointed, and angry right now. Yes, I said angry twice. Last night, I participated in a remembrance of Kristallnacht, attended by many people of various faith traditions here in the town where I live. One of the speakers, Ken Gordon, the state rep from my area, said that he spent the last several weeks before the election campaigning door to door in Pennsylvania. And he experienced firsthand what some of the mood there was. And he said that voters that he spoke with expressed the feeling that one candidate joined them in their anger with his words and demeanor. There's that anger word again. I wonder if Jesus was angry in today's gospel when he said, "Beware of the scribes who devour the property of widows. Amen, I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all the others put into the treasury, for they have all put in from their surplus, but she, from her poverty, has put in all she had." Because if the scribes devoured the property of widows, then one wonders whether this widow was poor because her property had been devoured by a corrupt scribe. Our friend, I call her our friend, Diana Butler Bass, whose book we read as a community earlier this year, speculates that the widow was motivated by anger when she put her last 2 coins into the temple treasury as a way to deprive that scribe from her last tiny bit of wealth by donating it and thus keeping it from the scribe's greedy tentacles. I think it's important to pause here just briefly to note that not all scribes were corrupt. In fact, the portion of the gospel we read last week was about a scribe who was not. So this text is not an anti-scribe text, and it is not an anti-Jewish text. It is an anti-corruption text, and there are corrupt individuals everywhere. How well we know that right here in the US. So what are we to do? One way to answer that question is to ask, what did Jesus do? And one way to answer that is to take a look at the portion of the Gospel of Mark that we've been reading for the past couple months, including today's portion, because Jesus has been teaching and preaching that we are to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. That we are to recognize that taking care of the most vulnerable is a higher priority than figuring out who is the greatest. And so we put behind us all quibbling about who is the greatest, and we turn to taking care of the most vulnerable. And there are plenty. Jesus has been teaching and preaching that we serve one another, and that is the way to realize God's glory in this life. Serve one another. And Jesus has been teaching and preaching that we are to love God and to love the neighbor, especially our neighbor who is marginalized, who is poor. And that is the way of Christ. When others are militaristic, triumphalist, corrupt, let us take care of one another with love. Let us protect and reach out to the poor, the racialized, the forgotten, the hurting, the targets of bigotry. Let us devote our whole selves to God's rule of love. Let us tap in to each of our own abilities and our own talents and figure out, what must we say? What must we write? To whom must we write? What must our actions be? Jesus speaks with humility, but also with strength and authority. And he advises the disciples and us to notice the Christ in the widow and in all who are like her. We stand strong with one another so that we might be the Christ and see the Christ in our words, in our actions, in our donations.